we are going to be looking at the unity or the divine simplicity of God. Now, when we talk about unity, it can incorporate two different things. One of the ideas in unity involves the Trinity, the unity between the Father, Son, and the Spirit. However, we're not going to be looking at that aspect of unity until we get to the Trinity. Unity here, I'm associating with divine simplicity. And what that means is it deals with the attributes of God and how the attributes of God relate to the person of God. Now, we've been going overall so far with what's called the incommunicable attributes. That is, attributes that are predominantly not shared with mankind. They're predominantly God's and God's alone. Now, we may have a tiny little aspect of it, but of these, or experience them later on in eternity, but predominantly these are God. This is going to be the end of the incommunicable attributes, and after we get through with this, we're going to look at the communicable attributes, or attributes that are shared with mankind. And this includes things such as knowledge. We have knowledge. God has knowledge, so it's a communicable thing. But divine simplicity or unity. When it comes to this idea of God's attributes and his nature or his person, there are three leading views. One view says that God is made up of various attributes that are all joined together. But it says that God is a collection of attributes that are all united together. That's one concept. Another concept is this, that God is a being, and the attributes are added to him. So he has various attributes added to him. There's a third aspect, or a third concept, and that is, now, this is not a perfect illustration, because if we tried to combine all these colors, you wouldn't be able to distinguish anything. You have God, and the attributes are part of who God is. Now, admittedly, these are lines. These lines represent the attributes. But imagine these lines actually, each line fills the entire circle. If I tried that, you wouldn't see any lines. It's not a perfect illustration, but it works in this case just for purposes of diagramming something. But the idea here is that each of God's attributes are within his entire person, totally and completely. So let's say this first line is the attribute of, let's go gospel presentation, wrath. Okay, so I'll just put W for wrath. This line is wrath. Well, the way it would work is wrath will be all of it. Let's say this one is attribute of grace, all of it. Hence why I can't just draw it out where it's fully filled in. But the idea is that each attribute is all of God. And I have it defined a little bit more clearly here. God's whole being includes all attributes fully and simultaneously. Now, the question is, which one is it? Anybody remember that old Sesame Street song? One of these things is not like the other. One of these things is not quite the same. The idea of one doesn't belong. Well, in this case, one of these things is not like the other. The other two things are totally wrong. Which one? Is God a collection of attributes? Are attributes added to God? Or are the attributes part and parcel of who he is? Well, to help figure this out, here are some definitions of unity or divine simplicity. Mueller defines it this way. Now, Mueller tends to have a very academic approach to his definitions. And yes, I included the Latin term here. But he defines, I think he uses divine simplicity for the term, but he defines it this way. The attributes of God are not accidents, but his very divine essence, since God is absolutely simple in his divine being. When he says accidents or accidentia, he's not referring to, oops, I didn't mean for that to happen. No, accident here is chance. What he's saying is this: God's attributes are not coming into existence just by chance. They're part of who he is. Well, Got Questions Ministries, which you've seen me use a lot, it's a good resource, a great resource, actually. They define it this way, and here they actually had a good definition. Divine simplicity is the concept that God does not exist in parts, but is wholly unified with no distinct attributes and whose existence is synonymous with his essence. Still a bit academic. So let's look at Grudem. Grudem, who tries to combine academic and, every man's language, defines it this way. God is not divided into parts, yet we see different attributes of God emphasized at different times. Now, while that's an easier to understand definition, essentially his definition is God is not divided into parts. Well, that's clear. A little bit short there. This is probably my favorite. Matthew Barrett, who writing on the Gospel Coalition website, wrote this. Simplicity, or you could say unity, simplicity means God is not made up of parts. He is not composite or a compounded being. He is simple. All that is in God is God. So based on these four definitions, they're all leaning to this one. They're essentially rejecting these two as unbiblical. Are they right? Are they wrong? Well, let's take a look at Scripture. Someone want to turn to 1 John, and there's going to be two passages out of 1 John. 1 John chapter 1 and 1 John chapter 4. So who wants to, out of 1 John 1 is verse 5. So 1 John 1 verse 5, who wants to read that? All right. And now 1 John 4 verse 8. Couple key things in here. We have in chapter 1 verse 5 that God is light. In chapter 4, John says God is love. These would be attributes of God. But you notice he says God is. God is light. God is love. Not God contains love or God has love. God is love. God is light. What he's doing here is he's associating the person of God with the attributes of God. He's treating them as synonymous. The attributes and the person are actually inseparable. So what we have here is the attributes and the person would fit this. With this one, we have God separated from his attributes because attributes are added to God. God can exist apart from his attributes. Well, here, God is a composite of his attributes, and his attributes are not really totally him. You have parts and little things here and there that are just combined together. And you don't have the God, let's say this one here is light. Well, God is light. If that is God and he's a collection, God is light. And he is love. So God is light. Well, God is part light. No. God is, light is all of that. Love is all of that, which goes to this idea. Now, a little further on, let's go to the Old Testament. Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7 say this. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. Now, this is Moses writing here. Like John later on, here Moses is describing the nature and the attributes of God as one and the same. There's no distinction between the two. He's talking about God's mercy. He's talking about God's anger in the same sentence, both of them in verse 6. Talks about steadfast love, forgiveness. But also later on in verse 7, you not only have love and forgiveness, you also have the idea of not clearing the guilty and visiting the iniquity, judgment, wrath. This is who God is. So from Scripture, what we learn is that God is not a collection of parts. Attributes are not separate from God and simply added to them. They are inseparable. To describe God's attributes is to describe God himself. Now, as we've seen from last week, not all attributes are going to be expressed at the same time. For example, I talked about in hell, the perfect wrath of God. No grace, no mercy, pure wrath. But God has grace, God has mercy, and God has wrath. But he doesn't express it in hell. In heaven, there's no wrath, grace, mercy. But God is also a God of wrath. That's one of his attributes. But it's not expressed in heaven. So, not all attributes are expressed at the same time. But the idea here is that God's attributes and God's person are not separable. Some problems with these two views is this. This view of the attributes where God is really just a collection of attributes added together is really twofold. One, this makes God into parts. Well, as we've seen, God doesn't have parts. So if God doesn't have parts, he can't be a collection of parts. It also means that if you take away an attribute, you still have God, just with an attribute removed. But you can only do that if he has parts. Here, you have God separate from his attributes, and again, God has parts. God is a container, you could say. But also, what would hold these things together? Ultimately, if you really if you really think about this, what ends up holding this together or holding this together, God has to depend upon something outside of himself to keep himself together, which means God would no longer be God, but whatever it is that's holding him together becomes God. And we've got a problem doctrinally because God is God. This is the way that we should understand the idea that God's attributes and his person are inseparable. Now, there are some implications of this, some positive and some negative implications. First, the positive implications. The doctrine of God's unity or simplicity means that God's person and God's attributes are not separable. Now, that has an impact on how we view God's omnipresence. That means that where one of God's attributes is expressed, God himself is also there because the two are inseparable. This also reminds us the fact that God and his attributes are inseparable reminds us the fact that God is unchanging. God's not going to have attributes added here this way or added that way. No. God is unchanging. The God of wrath is always going to be the same God of wrath from eternity past to eternity future. God of grace, same God, same attributes. Whatever those other attributes may be, same God. God doesn't change. And so he's dependable in that. So this really affirms the idea of immutability. And if you missed that, we actually talked about immutability in the past. Now, this I rephrased from gotquestions.com, but what they ended up saying, and I thought they said it pretty well, what this means is that because God is unified, because God is divinely simple, it means that God is simple enough for a child to believe in him. But he's also complex enough that we adults will spend an eternity learning about him. Those are some of the positive implications. But there are some negative implications of rejecting divine simplicity. To reject divine simplicity or unity is to reject the God of Scripture. And we don't want to do that. Also, it creates, as I've already discussed, it creates a God who is divided or dividable and can be against himself. You can divide God here. And, well, God cannot be divided against himself. God cannot be divided. God doesn't change. Also, as I've said, these other views, rejecting unity, creates a God made up of parts, which he's not. Also, as I've said, it creates a deity that is dependent on something outside of himself to keep the parts together. The last one I've written down there has a very long word that I'm going to go ahead and write it down. Part of the word you've heard of, and the parts of the word, when we break it apart, will make sense. Monopolytheism. Monopolytheism. Now that's a big word. When you break this down, theism, now I'm going to use a little g because a theist doesn't necessarily believe in Yahweh. So theists believe that there's a God. So monopolytheism believes that there's a God. Polytheism, many gods. Mono actually refers to the idea of the humanness of God. Or, as Barrett defined it, monopolytheism is the belief that there is one God, but he looks a lot like the gods of mythology, possessing human attributes only in greater measure. So monopolytheism has this as a god. My stick man is back. Yay! We'll give him a crooked halo because he's not a real god. Monopolytheism says God looks like us, and there's only one God. But this God is like superhuman. Imagine Zeus, but even stronger. Problem with that is this. That makes God into essentially one of us, but stronger. That's not who God is. But if we reject divine unity, we end up with that doctrine. And so we don't want to have a false doctrine. Besides, Scripture makes it clear. God's attributes and God's person are inseparable. If we remove the wrath from God, see, he's no longer God. If we remove love from God, he ceases to be God. If we remove grace, he ceases to be God. Remove any one of God's attributes, he ceases to be God. But he's always going to be God, and he's always going to have all of those attributes in his entire person. Now, that being said, that actually concludes unity.